The two men squared up, loosening their limbs and shadowboxing as they waited for the off. This straightener had been a long time coming, and the pressure cooker of the last few weeks in Toxteth and Dingle between two groups had finally boiled over. Johnny Phillips of Toxteth, a powerful man and friend of Curtis Warren, had taken an interest in a pub called Cheers on Egbert Road that his mother-in-law wanted to buy. David Ungi, a popular Dingle-based figure and talented boxer, frequented Cheers with his friends and family. They considered the pub their local until Phillips staked his claim. Phillips allegedly wanted to assert his dominance over the pub, making it clear that Ungi and his associates were no longer welcome at Cheers, barring them. This led to a dispute, and ultimately, the straightener that both sides were now preparing for on Bile Street. Both factions arrived with armed men to ensure fair play was adhered to. According to sources, David Ungi, the skilled boxer and former Golden Gloves champion, got the better of Phillips, who despite his physical power, lacked Ungi's finesse and skill in combat. Bloodied and battered, Phillips was far from done. He proclaimed loudly to all who would listen that Ungi had used knuckle dusters, declaring the fight unfair. What followed was an eruption of gang warfare that Liverpool had never seen before. If David Ungi thought the dispute had ended with his victorious street fight, he was in for a rude awakening. The very next day, as he drove through Toxteth, he noticed a Nissan trailing him, carrying 4 men. What unsettled him most was the sight in his rearview mirror, balaclavas covering the faces of the passengers, one of whom he was certain was Johnny Phillips. Fearing for his life, Ungi quickly manoeuvred his car toward his mother's house, hoping to find safety. He had half expected some form of reprisal after the rumours about the knuckle dusters began to circulate, but he didn't know if they were armed or just posturing for intimidation. As he turned into Morton Street, his heart sank. The Nissan had overtaken him and was now blocking the road. The 4 masked men stepped out, their menacing figures silhouetted against the streetlights. Ungi's instincts took over, not spotting any visible weapons, and with his characteristic bravado, he jumped out of his car, ready to confront his pursuers. That confidence evaporated in an instant when one of the men drew a firearm, bracing himself to fire. Without hesitation, Ungi bolted toward his mother's house, zigzagging to avoid the bullets that whizzed past his head. Adrenaline propelled him forward, his breath ragged as he sprinted for safety. He reached the sanctuary of his mother's home unscathed, but his mind reeled with disbelief. They had tried to kill him over a punch-up. The sheer brazenness of the attack sent a clear message. This was no longer just a personal feud, it was all-out war. David Ungi was not a big gangster. He was a businessman, a family man who could have a fight. Those who knew the Ungi family, like Charlie Sager, the veteran villain, say the eldest brother was particularly well regarded across the city's main faces. The brutal attack on David was met with a wave of anger and disgust, resonating deeply within their community. The backdrop of this tragedy cannot be divorced from the tension that simmered beneath the surface of Liverpool's streets. Racial divides, stoked by years of systemic inequality and mistrust, were still raw. The 1981 Toxteth riots, an explosive uprising by the predominantly black community against police oppression and racism, had left scars that had yet to heal. Resentment lingered, and many viewed the Ungi-Phillips feud as more than just a personal dispute. To some, it was emblematic of a deeper, more volatile division. People began to choose sides, and the city braced itself for what felt inevitable. A little over a month after the attempted ambush in Morton Street, Ungi, at just 36 years old, was driving along North Hill Street in his VW Passat on a warm May evening. North Hill Street, a quiet, wide road lined with play parks, takeaways, and rows of modern semi-detached houses, was the last place one might expect a deadly ambush. Ungi was on his way to meet 2 friends when a black VW Golf GTI suddenly swerved in front of his car, cutting him off. The door swung open, and a man jumped out, brandishing an automatic weapon. Realizing the danger, Ungi tried desperately to escape, but before he could act, the gunman opened fire. The father of 3 was struck twice, one of the bullets slicing through a main artery. He collapsed, bleeding out as his car became a chilling reminder of the escalating violence tearing through the city. It was a shocking and brazen attack, carried out in an area where children played and families went about their daily lives. By the next morning, the city was reeling as newspapers detailed the assassination. Ripples of disbelief spread far and wide. This was not just another gangland dispute, it was a turning point. The rules of engagement in Liverpool's underworld had changed, and and everyone knew it. For the Ungi family, the pain was unimaginable. A beloved son, brother, and father had been taken from them in a cold and calculated act of violence. The brutal nature of the attack amplified the tragedy. It was over a minor dispute. The days of fair fights were over. Violence in Liverpool had reached a new, terrifying threshold. As the city braced itself for the inevitable reprisals, the police were forced to act. Fearing an escalation of gun violence, they implemented drastic measures, flooding the streets with armed patrols and making their presence felt in neighbourhoods gripped by tension. But for those who knew the city, the writing was already on the wall. This was just the beginning of a cycle of bloodshed that would scar Liverpool for years to come. Shortly after the killing of Ungi, the revenge attack started. Cheers, the pub where the dispute had begun, went up in flames. In retaliation, shots were fired outside the Black George pub in Toxteth, where the younger generation of the Ungis drank. Only 8 days later, bouncer and enforcer Ricardo Rowe, an associate of Johnny Phillips, was training in the Kensington gym when two hooded men walked in and opened fire with automatic weapons, including an Uzi. Miraculously, Rowe was only hit in the elbow and initially refused to cooperate with the police. However, he later made a spectacular U-turn, claiming that the gunmen were Colin and Brian Ungi, who were allegedly seeking retribution for their brother's death. Word on the street was that Johnny Phillips had advised Rowe to implicate the Ungi brothers in the attack, a strategic move to outmaneuver his enemies in the ongoing feud violently unfolding across South Liverpool. Around this time, Curtis Warren reportedly slipped out of the country, unwilling to be associated with the feud his former associate had become entangled in. Gang wars were bad for business, and the last thing Warren wanted was to be drawn into the escalating conflict, which many villains were using to settle old scores under the guise of the chaos. The police were overwhelmed by reports of tit-for-tat shootings and violence spilling into the streets of Toxteth and Dingle. The racial divide of the two sides that lived in such close proximity played into the tensions, with many attributing racial undertones to the conflict. The fact that the initial dispute had arisen from a relatively minor display of dominance in a pub seemed lost amidst the violence now tearing through the streets. Families and innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire, with some too afraid to walk their children to school or let them play in parks for fear of stray bullets. Friends and relatives of those involved in the feud feared becoming targets simply by association. On May 15th, a 31-year-old man was found lying in a pool of blood on a road in Netherley, suffering from gunshot wounds to the leg. Just 5 days later, Paul Foster was shot at his home in Toxteth. The police issued an appeal for calm on May 22nd, after 5 people were injured in 2 separate shooting incidents in the city. That same day, shots were fired into a house in Anfield. 4 days later, Lee Parry was shot by gunmen in Toxteth. The escalating violence on Liverpool's streets was unlike anything the police had encountered before. The frequent use of automatic weapons forced authorities to deploy even more armed officers in an attempt to stifle the movements of gang members and regain control. Yet, despite the heightened police presence, the violence continued. During this period, 2 names, Bungie O'Rourke and Darren Jackson, were announced as suspects wanted in connection with David Ungi's murder. Both men reportedly fled the UK for Jamaica, but on July 28th, O'Rourke's family home was sprayed with bullets, a clear indication that the feud was far from over. The outbreak of gun violence was so sudden and chaotic that the police struggled to differentiate between incidents directly linked to the feud and those committed by opportunists capitalizing on the disorder. Meanwhile, Johnny Phillips, one of the feud's key instigators, had managed to distance himself from the immediate conflict. Following Ungi's murder, he left the city for a holiday in Jamaica, only to be arrested upon his return in June at Manchester Airport. However, the charge was for the earlier attempted murder of Ungi, not his actual death. Phillips was initially denied bail, as the judge feared he might be killed before his trial, given the animosity on the streets towards him and his associates from David Ungi's supporters. His defence team claimed he was being victimised and that the accusations were fabricated, even pointing to a newspaper article that described the gunman as white. The prosecution's case rested heavily on a single witness who had repeatedly failed to attend identification parades. Eventually, Phillips was granted bail on the condition that he not enter Liverpool for his own safety and took up temporary residence in Manchester. During his time in Manchester, Phillips reportedly approached Stephen the Devil French, a self-confessed tacksman and martial arts expert, for assistance. According to French's account in his book, The Devil, Phillips struck a deal with him, offering £15,000, a firearm, and assistance in intimidating witnesses in a case French was facing. Whether this account is accurate remains unclear, but the star witness in Phillips's case eventually backtracked, leading to the charges being dropped. However, Phillips's troubles were far from over. Just 3 weeks after his release, on October 25th, Phillips's partner returned home after dropping their child at nursery. As she parked their top-of-the-range BMW in the leafy suburb of Mersey Avenue in Aigburth, a black Mondeo drove past, spraying their car and house with automatic gunfire. Both Phillips and his partner were unharmed, but the attack underscored the unrelenting nature of the feud. The following week, on October 31st, the home of Johnny Ungi, a relative of David Ungi, was sprayed with bullets, followed by the November 8th shooting of Jason Speed at his home in Huyton. The violence reached its peak in December 1995, with 5 people shot, 1 fatally, and a gun attack on a police shop. All this played out while Colin and Brian Ungi, who were on remand for the alleged shooting of Ricardo Rowe at the Kensington gym, awaited their trial. The tensions were so high that all parties agreed to move the trial out of Liverpool, with the pair remaining in custody until the case could be heard in May of the following year in Preston. Johnny Phillips was celebrating his 35th birthday. He had planned a day out with his partner Maria and their daughter. As he opened his car door in Toxteth, he looked up to see a gunman approaching, unmasked and determined. Realizing the immediate danger, Phillips acted on instinct, throwing his young daughter into the car in an attempt to shield her. His partner Maria stood frozen in horror as the gunman fired 4 shots into Phillips before jumping into a getaway car with 2 associates and speeding off. The attack was shocking, another violent chapter in a city that had already endured so much bloodshed. Once again, innocent lives were scarred by the brutality of the feud. Both Maria and their daughter were left deeply traumatized, with Maria later telling the media that she feared she would be the next target, having seen the gunman's face. Phillips, critically injured, somehow survived the attempt on his life and was eventually released from the hospital after what doctors described as a miraculous recovery. However, his family voiced anger and frustration at the lack of police protection, feeling abandoned as the violence continued to spiral out of control. Even law enforcement was not immune to the chaos, with reports of a masked gunman shooting a police officer around the same time. The city was shaken to its core. The escalation in violence, from fistfights to armed attacks on families, was unprecedented. It all traced back to the killing of David Ungi and the seemingly trivial pub dispute that had ignited a wave of senseless killings. The systematic shift in both the city's gang culture and its policing was undeniable. Months after surviving the assassination attempt, Johnny Phillips mysteriously died. Police ruled the cause of death as natural, but his family remained unconvinced. Despite their protests, investigations led to the case being officially closed, with no further action taken. Phillips's funeral was an extravagant affair, complete with horse-drawn carriages. The procession passed by Cheers pub, the original flashpoint of the conflict, as if to serve as a grim reminder of how a minor disagreement could lead to such devastating consequences. The violence had not only shattered families, but also deeply affected entire communities, leaving scars that would last for years. The Ungi brothers, meanwhile, were cleared of the shooting at Vic's gym in Kensington. While this verdict brought some resolution to their involvement, it was far from the end of gun crime in Liverpool. Nevertheless, it seemed to draw an uneasy line under the Phillips-Ungi feud, a conflict that had claimed lives and forever changed the face of the city's underworld.